Our Old Testament devotional thought today comes from our reading in Genesis chapter 18 with the great encounter of Abraham with God, what theologians would call a theophany, where God physically manifested his presence to them. Now, usually this would have been Jesus, the angel of the Lord, the captain of the Lord's host, Melchizedek, okay? Comes under many different names in the Old Testament, but this was a physical manifestation of God. This would have been Jesus in his pre-incarnate state. Now, in Genesis 18, verses 1 to 5, the Lord appears and God initiates this encounter. And I kind of like that when God wants to say something to us, he doesn't mind initiating the encounter. Sometimes we think it's all on us, but there are times that God has something to say to us, and he initiates the encounter. Now, most of us would be very happy with God's encounter and the promise that he makes to us and the rhema that he speaks to us. And, we would just be so excited. And then we would go back to sleep or we would go home after service. But that wasn't Abraham. The principle I want you to see is this. When you press in to learn beyond the promises, he'll teach you more. Let me say that again. When you press in to learn past the promises, you begin to learn more about a lot of things. Now, in verses 16 to 21, Abraham went out with them to send them on their way. He shows them respect. He says, all right, you've made me beautiful promises. I'm not going to say goodbye, see you later, and go back inside my tent and rejoice in the promise. Instead, it says he went with them to send them on their way. As a sign of respect, he escorted them out. Many times when I visit you in your homes, one of the young people will walk me down the street to the next house. Why do you do that? It's a thing of respect. We've all been taught this since we were children. We walk somebody on to the next place. Now, this is what Abraham did. He began to walk with God and these other angels who were with him, and he was showing respect. Now, as he walked with them, the Lord said, should I hide my plan from Abraham? Starting in verse 17. Now, notice the things because Abraham pressed in past the promises, what he learned. He learned that God had a plan. He learned his own future. Abraham will become a great and mighty nation, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. He learned God's motives. Verse 19, I've singled him out so that he will direct his sons and their families to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. Then I will do for Abraham all that I have promised. He learned God's motives and God's expectations. God said, I've done this so that he would be careful to raise his family well. Sometimes you need to realize that God has made great and precious promises to you so that you will direct your children well. And he learned God's character. Verse 18 to 21. He said, I have heard a great outcry from Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin is so great. I'm going down to see if their actions are as wicked as I have heard, and if not, I want to know. Now he learned something about God he has no comprehension of. He learned that God is not just the blesser. He learned that God is not just good. He's learned that God is also the judge, and that God holds people accountable for their actions. Now, this was a new revelation for Abram. The only thing he had ever known of God was goodness and blessing. He didn't know the fact that God was also a judge. And there are many Christians today because they park at the promises and they don't press in to know more about God. They get really shocked when God does an act of judgment because they don't realize God is also just. God is also holy. And God also holds this world accountable for its sins and for its actions. So now we have the third stage. The first stage was God's initiation and the promises are made. The second stage, Abraham walks with him. He learns about God's character. He learns about God's motives. He learns about God's expectations. He learns about God's plan. Now the third stage, this is when he's a little confused about God. Verses 22 and 23. But the Lord remained with Abram, and Abram approached him and said, will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked? Now, I don't think he's just thinking about his nephew Lot down there, Okay. Lot's righteous soul was vexed by his sin. So Lot did live a righteous life. But I don't think he was just thinking about Lot. He'd seen something about the character of God, and he had a question. Lord, will you sweep away both the righteous and the wicked? And then he kept pressing in. He said, all right, Lord, will you spare the righteous? Will you spare a city if there's 50, 45, 30, 35, 25? He gets all the way down to 10, and then he stops. Now, why did he stop with 10? He doesn't think that there's enough in Lot's family to compile 10. Lot, his wife, his 2 daughters. The daughters are not married yet, so there's not. He didn't just stop with Lot's family. He stopped before Lot's family. He stopped when he understood that God is so merciful that for the sake of the righteous, God will stop his judgment upon the wicked. I wonder how many airplanes have not crashed because of a righteous Lola or a righteous Lolo sitting on that airplane. I wonder how many times the city of Manila has been spared because of the righteous people in the city. God will spare the wicked of a place just because of the righteous that are there. And he learned another thing about God. He learned that God will patiently listen to a conversation and that God's not embarrassed to answer questions. Have you ever noticed how much time Jesus spent answering questions in the Gospels? Notice how many times Jesus answers questions. God's not intimidated by our questions. He doesn't mind having a conversation. God doesn't mind not doing all the talking. He doesn't mind listening and answering our questions. Now, beloved, if you really want to get to know God, you have to learn to press in past the promises. And the more you press in, the more you learn.